Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into a pretty interesting book. It's called The Case Against Socialism by Senator Rand Paul.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of this one. Seems very timely, with all the talk about socialism these days, especially among younger folks.
Right. It's almost like this topic you'd think is like ancient history, but it's definitely making a comeback.
For sure.
So we've got excerpts from the book itself. It lays out, well, as you can guess from the title, some pretty strong arguments against socialism. But it also digs into real-world examples, like what happened in Venezuela, for instance.
Ah, Venezuela. That's quite a story.
Definitely. Our mission today is to, well, cut through all the rhetoric, help you understand what socialism actually means, how it's played out in history, and why it should matter to you, even today.
Sounds like a plan.
Before we really get into the book's arguments, I think it's important to know a little bit about the author himself. So, who is Rand Paul, and what makes his take on this topic worth listening to?
Well, Rand Paul, he's a Republican senator from Kentucky. He's known for his pretty strong libertarian views.
Okay, so that means...
Basically championing individual liberty, limited government, that kind of thing. He's been a vocal critic of big government and a big supporter of free markets for a long time.
And I think it's interesting that he's also a physician. His medical background definitely informs his views, especially when it comes to healthcare.
Yeah, that's a unique perspective he brings to the table.
Absolutely, yeah. Now let's jump into the book itself. Right off the bat, Paul kind of acknowledges the appeal of socialist ideas.
Yeah.
Especially this idea of fairness, right? He even mentions a Harvard study that found over half of young Americans ages 18 to 29 don't support capitalism anymore.
Wow, over half, huh? That's pretty significant.
It is. And it shows you there's this growing disillusionment with capitalism, especially among millennials and Gen Z.
Yeah, they've seen recessions, inequality. It makes sense that they'd be looking for alternatives.
Totally.
Yeah.
But Paul's argument is that a lot of this disillusionment comes from not really understanding what socialism is. He points to this Reason Foundation survey that found only a tiny percentage of millennials could actually define socialism correctly as government ownership of the means of production. That's like the classic definition.
Right, right. So he's saying there's this gap between the ideal and the reality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Paul thinks a lot of young people are drawn to this idea of a system that's all about equality and social justice, which, sounds great on the surface.
Sure.
But his argument is that true fairness, it's not about redistributing wealth. It's about a system that rewards hard work and, individual merit.
So he's setting up this contrast between two different ideas of fairness.
Right. And to really hammer home his point, he spends a big chunk of the book looking at Venezuela.
Venezuela. Yeah, that's a tough situation down there.
It is. And he uses it as this case study in socialist failure.
So like a warning sign.
Exactly. Think about it. Venezuela, at one point, was the richest country in South America. Oil reserves, you name it.
And now?
Now, it's an economic disaster. Poverty, starvation, hyperinflation, the whole 9 yards. And Paul argues that this wasn't just because of, bad leaders.
He's not just blaming Chavez or Maduro?
No. He says it was decades of socialist policies that did this. Nationalizing industries, price controls, reckless spending. The list goes on.
So it's like a systemic problem, he's saying.
Right. And he goes back even further to, the 70s, when the Venezuelan government nationalized the whole oil sector.
Giving the government huge control over the most valuable resource in the country.
And that was, according to Paul and a lot of economists, a major turning point.
Interesting. It's like he's tracing this whole trajectory.
Exactly. And he doesn't just talk about the big economic picture. He also talks about the real human cost. Stories about people struggling to find food, medicine, even toilet paper.
It's easy to forget the impact on everyday people when you're talking about these big economic theories.
Right. And Paul also talks about, what he sees as the hypocrisy of socialist leaders. They claim to be for the poor, but then they're living in luxury. He even tells this story about Maduro, dining in the super expensive restaurant while his people are starving.
It's talk about a disconnect.
Right. It's this gap between the rhetoric and reality that Paul really wants to expose. Now, moving on from Venezuela, he tackles another big argument that people make for socialism, the Scandinavian countries.
Ah, yeah. People always point to those countries as, socialist success stories.
Right. But Paul pushes back against that. He says, sure, they have strong social safety nets, but they're fundamentally built on free market principles.
So he's saying their success comes from capitalism, not socialism.
Exactly. He argues that their welfare systems, they came later, after they already had a strong free market foundation.
Makes you wonder if those systems would work the same way in a different context.
Right. And to back this up, he brings up this book by Nima Sanadaji, Debunking Utopia, it's called.
Catchy title.
Yeah. And this book argues that, Sweden's success is really rooted in its capitalist past. He also points out that even in these Scandinavian countries, there are limitations on individual choice.
Like what?
Well, he talks about this case of a Swedish patient with MS who was denied this new expensive drug because of government policies.
So even with all the social programs, there are still trade-offs.
Exactly. And that's what Paul is trying to show. He's trying to dismantle this, rosy picture of socialist systems by looking at these different examples.
Okay, I'm starting to see where he's going with this. It's a lot more nuanced than just socialism is bad, right?
Most definitely. He's building a much more complex argument here.
All right, so we've set the stage with Venezuela and the Scandinavian comparison. Now let's dig into some of Paul's bigger economic arguments against socialism. He really dives deep here, claiming that socialism just fundamentally ignores human nature and basic economics.
So he's saying it's flawed from the ground up.
Yeah, pretty much. One of his main points is that people are naturally motivated by self-interest, right? And that socialist systems, they try to suppress that instinct, which, he sees as a huge mistake.
Interesting. So, socialism tries to make people act in ways they're not naturally inclined to?
That's his argument. And then he gets into the whole thing about price controls, which are a classic feature of socialist economies. He says they always lead to shortages and black markets.
Price controls, just to clarify for our listeners, are when the government sets a limit on how much something can cost.
Right. Like trying to make things more affordable, in theory. But Paul says it almost always backfires. And he uses a pretty good example to illustrate this. The gas shortages in the U.S. back in the 70s.
Oh, yeah. I remember learning about that.
Well, those were caused by, you guessed it, government price controls on gas.
So it's like trying to help people by keeping prices low, but then you end up with no gas at all.
Exactly. And then he brings it back to Venezuela, of course, where price controls on basic goods, they've led to massive shortages. It got so bad that the army had to be sent out to enforce the price limits. Just shows you how messed up things can get.
Wow, using the army to police prices, that's intense.
Right. And then there's this other statistic that Paul mentions. He says that something like 30,000 businesses were just straight up confiscated in Venezuela under Chavez.
So it's not just about price controls. It's about the government taking over private businesses.
Yeah, that's a key part of his argument. He sees it as a direct attack on private ownership, which is, a cornerstone of capitalism.
It definitely paints a bleak picture of what can happen under socialist regimes.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about Venezuela, price controls, and the impact on businesses. Where does Paul go from there?
Well, next he shifts gears a bit and starts talking about this whole idea of utopian thinking. He argues that the goal of creating a perfect society, which, is at the heart of a lot of socialist ideologies, it can actually be really dangerous.
Dangerous how?
Well, he thinks it can lead to authoritarianism, even violence.
Okay, so he's saying that the pursuit of utopia can actually backfire and create the opposite of a perfect society.
Exactly. And he uses some pretty heavy historical examples to back this up. He talks about the Soviet Union, China under Mao, even Cambodia under Pol Pot.
Yeah, those are all regimes that had, some pretty horrific consequences.
Right. And Paul's argument is that these regimes, they were all driven by this utopian vision, this belief that they could create a perfect society if they just had enough power and control.
So he's connecting utopian ideals with totalitarian regimes. It's a pretty bold claim.
It is. And to support this idea, he brings in the work of some pretty famous philosophers like Karl Popper. Popper was this guy who argued against what's called historical determinism.
Historical determinism, that's the idea that history is on a set path towards a specific outcome.
Right. Yeah. And Paul's saying that this kind of thinking, it can be really dangerous because it can be used to justify all sorts of terrible things. Like, if you believe that history is inevitably moving towards a communist utopia, then you might be willing to do whatever it takes to get there, even if it means, using violence or oppression.
That's pretty scary when you think about it.
Yeah, it is. And Paul uses this really chilling story to illustrate his point. It's about a woman in China during the Cultural Revolution. Her name was Feng Zhongmu, and she was actually executed just for criticizing Mao Zedong.
Wow, just for criticizing the leader. That's a stark example of how suppressing dissent can lead to, well, really tragic outcomes.
Right. And then Paul goes even further and makes this kind of surprising connection. He compares this kind of stifling of dissent in socialist regimes to what he sees as the rise of cancel culture and political correctness in the West.
So he's saying that there are parallels between, like, totalitarian regimes and what's happening in, say, America today.
Yeah, that's his argument. He's saying that even in democratic societies, attempts to silence opposing views, even if they seem well-intentioned, they can have these really chilling effects on free speech and open debate. And he uses a personal example to illustrate this. He talks about how he was criticized for not clapping enthusiastically enough for Benjamin Netanyahu during a speech to Congress.
Okay, so he's saying that even something as seemingly minor as not clapping enough can be seen as a form of, like, thought policing.
Yeah, that's his point. He's arguing that we need to be really careful about how we police speech and ideas, even in seemingly harmless ways, because it can create a climate where people are afraid to speak their minds. And that, he says, is a slippery slope towards a more authoritarian society.
It's definitely a thought-provoking comparison.
Yeah.
It makes you think about where we draw the line between, like, acceptable social pressure and actual suppression of dissent.
Right. And from there, Paul moves on to talk about the surveillance state. He argues that the growing use of surveillance technology, especially in places like China, has the potential to create this really dystopian social credit system.
Like the one they're implementing in China.
Exactly. And he connects this back to his earlier points about utopian thinking and the dangers of government control.
So he's saying that this pursuit of a perfect society, combined with these powerful technologies, it could lead to a situation where the government has way too much control over people's lives.
Yeah. And he brings up this sci-fi book, Minority Report, to illustrate this point. Remember that one? Where people are arrested for crimes they haven't even committed yet.
Oh yeah, that's a pretty chilling concept.
Well, Paul's arguing that we're not that far off from that reality. He points to things like facial recognition technology and predictive policing algorithms, which are already being used in some places.
So he's saying that the line between science fiction and reality is getting blurry?
Exactly. And to really drive home the creepiness of this, he shares this example from Beijing. At the Temple of Heaven, they're actually using facial recognition to ration toilet paper. Like, you have to scan your face to get toilet paper.
Wait, what? That's like next level surveillance.
Right. It might seem like a small thing, but Paul's point is that it shows how this technology can be used to control even the most mundane aspects of people's lives. And that's a trend he's really worried about.
I can see why. It's definitely a lot to think about.
So we've talked about Venezuela, price controls, utopian thinking, surveillance, a lot of ground covered. But there's this other layer that Paul digs into that I think is really interesting. He kind of gets into the philosophy behind socialism.
Yeah, that's an important piece, right? To really understand where these ideas are coming from.
Exactly. And Paul's argument is that socialism, at its core, it comes from this utopian vision of a perfect society.
So it's not just about economic policies, it's about a whole worldview.
Right. And he says that this utopian vision, it's often based on a pretty flawed understanding of human nature.
Flawed how?
Well, he says a lot of socialists believe that humans are basically good, and that if we just had the right social structures in place, we could get rid of all the bad stuff, like poverty, greed, conflict, all of it.
Okay, so he's saying they're too optimistic about human nature.
Yeah, that's one way to put it. He thinks they ignore the reality that humans are, complicated. We're capable of great things, but also terrible things. And any system that doesn't take that into account is just doomed to fail.
It's like trying to build a system for angels when you're dealing with, humans.
Exactly. And then he goes even further and says that this pursuit of utopia, this drive to create a perfect society, it can actually lead to tyranny.
Tyranny. How does he make that connection?
He says that people in power, when they're convinced that they have the answer, the key to this perfect society, they can become, pretty ruthless.
Because they think the ends justify the means, I guess.
Right. And he points to historical examples to support this, like the suppression of dissent, the use of violence, even mass murder, all in the name of creating this so-called utopia.
So he's saying that good intentions don't always equal good outcomes, especially when you have power involved.
Yeah, kind of. And Paul's message here is really one of caution. He's saying we need to be wary of any ideology that claims to have all the answers, whether it's socialism or anything else.
So humility is important, basically, recognizing that we don't have all the answers.
Right. And he says a healthy society, it's one that embraces different viewpoints, a free exchange of ideas, not one that tries to force everyone into the same mold.
It's about allowing for disagreement and debate.
Exactly. Now, it's worth mentioning that this book, it's gotten a lot of attention, both positive and negative.
Yeah, that's not surprising. It's a pretty controversial topic.
For sure. People who like the book, they often praise Paul for his writing style. They say it's clear, easy to understand, even when he's talking about complex economics.
And they probably also appreciate his strong defense of individual liberty and free markets.
Right. They see it as a valuable contribution to the whole debate about socialism.
On the other hand, people who criticize the book, they often say he oversimplifies things, like that he doesn't really engage with the nuances of different socialist systems or the potential benefits of some social welfare programs.
Yeah, some critics say he's a bit too black and white in his thinking.
Which, is a fair point. It's a complex topic, and there are definitely different perspectives on it.
Totally. But even if you don't agree with everything Paul says, I think this book is still worth reading.
Yeah, it's definitely thought-provoking. It makes you question your own assumptions about, the role of government, economic equality, all of that.
For sure. And at the end of the day, that's what a good book should do, right? Make you think.
Absolutely. So, if you're interested in learning more about this topic, definitely check out The Case Against Socialism by Rand Paul. It's a book that'll spark some good conversations, that's for sure.